Hello, everyone, and welcome to our exploration of the mystery of Atlantis, where we sift through layers of ancient accounts, scientific clues, and enduring questions to understand one of the world's most captivating legends. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Atlantis stands as a famous lost civilization that sits between myth, philosophy, and pseudo-history, a place said to have vanished beneath the waves in a single day of catastrophe. From the moment it first appeared in written records, it has invited speculation about advanced societies, sudden disasters, and the thin line separating memory from invention. The central mystery remains whether Atlantis was a real place, a distorted memory of some long-forgotten event, or simply an invented story crafted for a deeper purpose. That question has never been settled, and it continues to pull at our curiosity because it touches on how civilizations rise, fall, and are remembered. The legend has survived for over 2 millennia precisely because it blends the familiar with the unreachable. It offers a mirror to our own anxieties about hubris and collapse, while promising the thrill of discovery just out of reach. Each generation finds new reasons to revisit it, whether through seafaring tales, philosophical debates, or modern searches that turn ancient words into maps. What began as a single narrative has grown into a cultural touchstone that shapes popular imagination across books, films, and expeditions, keeping the idea alive long after its original teller was gone. In the sections ahead, we will follow the major lines of inquiry that keep this story alive: Plato's original telling and the context in which it was written, the archaeological record that might anchor it to real events, the geological forces that could explain a city's disappearance, and the modern speculation that sometimes stretches far beyond the evidence. We approach the topic as an evidence-based investigation rather than a treasure hunt, weighing what can be tested against what remains suggestive but unproven. This means pausing at each claim to ask what the data actually supports and where interpretation steps in. By the end, we will see how Atlantis functions less as a single lost island, and more as a lens through which people have examined human achievement and its limits. The stakes are not about finding gold or sunken palaces, but about understanding how stories endure and what they reveal when examined carefully. We begin that process now by returning to the source that first placed a city beneath the sea. Plato tells the story by placing Atlantis at the heart of two dialogues written around 360 BCE, the Timaeus and the Critias. In these works, the philosopher uses the tale as part of a larger conversation about ideal societies, the nature of the cosmos, and the long sweep of human history. The account does not appear in any earlier surviving Greek text, and Plato presents it as information that reached him through a specific chain of transmission rather than as his own invention. The basic narrative begins with an island empire located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. This empire, Atlantis, controlled a vast territory that stretched from the Atlantic islands inward to parts of North Africa and southern Europe. Its capital was built on a circular island ringed by concentric canals, a layout that combined natural harbors with elaborate engineering. At the center stood a temple dedicated to Poseidon and Cleito, surrounded by gold-covered walls, silver towers, and hot and cold springs that supplied elaborate baths for people and animals alike. Atlantis grew immensely wealthy through trade, mining, and agriculture. Its rulers extracted orichalcum, a metal described as more precious than anything except gold, and they used it to plate the walls of their most important buildings. The island supported a large population of citizens, farmers, and soldiers, all organized under a system of 10 kings who met regularly to administer laws inscribed on a pillar inside the temple. Military power flowed from a standing army of more than 1 million men, supported by a navy of 1,200 ships and vast numbers of chariots and elephants. The turning point arrives when Atlantis launches an unprovoked war against the ancient world. Its forces cross the sea and subdue Libya as far as Egypt and Europe as far as Italy. Only Athens, then a small but virtuous city, stands in the way. The Athenians alone repel the invasion, driving the Atlantean army back to the sea. At that moment, the story reaches its sudden end. Violent earthquakes and floods strike the island in a single day and night of misfortune. Atlantis sinks beneath the waves, and the same cataclysm buries the Athenian warriors who had fought on foreign soil. The sea in that region becomes unnavigable because of the mud and wreckage left behind. Plato attributes this entire account to an earlier source. He traces it through the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who visited Egypt around 590 BCE. And heard the story from priests at the temple of Neith and Sais. Those priests claimed the events took place 9,000 years before their own time, a figure that places the war roughly 9,600 BCE. Solon reportedly shared the tale with his friend Dropides, whose descendants preserved it until it reached Plato's relative Critias the Younger. In the dialogues, Critias tells the story to Socrates and others during a gathering that includes the astronomer Timaeus. Every concrete detail about the size of the island, the layout of the capital, the number of kings, the military forces, the temple decorations, and the precise manner of destruction comes directly from these two dialogues. Plato supplies no additional adventures, no later survivals, and no claim that Atlantis possessed technologies beyond what Bronze Age or earlier societies might have achieved. The dialogues break off before Critias can finish describing the constitution of ancient Athens, leaving the full contrast between the two societies incomplete. Later traditions added many elements that Plato never mentioned. Stories of a submerged continent the size of Europe and Asia combined, of crystal palaces, of flying machines, or of survivors fleeing to other lands do not appear in the Timaeus or Critias. Plato's Atlantis is an island roughly the size of modern Turkey or larger, not a continental landmass, and its disappearance is total except for the shallow mud banks that remain. The priests in the story emphasize that the account was preserved in Egyptian records, yet no such records have ever been identified outside Plato's text. By returning to these original passages, we see how tightly the legend is bound to its first written form. The story functions inside Plato's larger argument about how even the best societies can fall when they turn from virtue to conquest. Its dramatic destruction serves as a cautionary illustration rather than a report of recent news. Everything that follows in later centuries builds on this foundation, sometimes faithfully, and sometimes by grafting on entirely new material. The next step is to ask what Plato himself may have intended the story to convey. Welcome to our deep dive into the mystery of Atlantis. In this video, we trace the legend from its first appearance in ancient texts through centuries of speculation, geological clues, and modern searches to understand why it still fascinates us today. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Now that we have Plato's account in front of us, the natural question is what he actually intended by it. Many scholars argue that Atlantis was never meant as a straightforward historical report, but as a philosophical allegory designed to illustrate ideas about politics, virtue, and the dangers of unchecked power. Plato wrote the Timaeus and Critias around 360 BCE, a period when he was deeply engaged with questions of the ideal state. In works such as the Republic, he had already sketched a perfectly ordered society, governed by reason and justice. Atlantis, by contrast, serves as its dramatic opposite, a once great power that falls because it abandons those principles. Within Plato's broader political thought, the story dramatizes the cycle of moral decline. A society begins in harmony with divine order, grows strong through discipline and restraint, then succumbs to hubris when wealth and conquest corrupt its leaders. The Atlantean kings start as wise rulers who honor Poseidon and maintain just laws, yet their growing ambition leads them to launch an unjust war. That aggression triggers divine punishment in the form of sudden cataclysm. The narrative therefore functions as a cautionary tale about how even the mightiest empire can destroy itself when it loses sight of virtue. To sharpen the lesson, Plato sets Atlantis against ancient Athens as mirror opposites. Atlantis represents overwhelming material power, vast territory, advanced engineering, and a massive military machine. Athens stands for moral excellence, civic unity, and courageous defense of freedom despite its smaller size. The contrast is deliberate. One society is driven by appetite and expansion, the other by reason and self-sacrifice. When Athens prevails, the story underscores that true strength lies in character rather than numbers or riches. This pairing of ideal and corrupt states echoes themes running through Plato's dialogues, where he repeatedly tests how different constitutions shaped the souls of citizens. Ancient authors often used invented settings for exactly this kind of moral and political exploration. Mythical islands, distant lands, and imagined cities allowed writers to examine ideas without the constraints of verifiable history. Plato's own teacher Socrates appears in dialogues that place him in clearly fictional conversations, and the same technique appears in works by other thinkers who created exotic backdrops to debate justice or the good life. In this literary context, Atlantis fits comfortably as a thought experiment rather than a news dispatch from 9,000 years earlier. Still, the question remains whether Plato expected his audience to read the story literally, symbolically, or both at once. The dialogues present the tale through a careful chain of transmission, complete with named sources and precise details, which gives it an air of historical authenticity. Yet the setting is placed so far in the past that no living memory could confirm or refute it. Plato may have counted on readers recognizing the philosophical purpose while still enjoying the vivid narrative as if it were real. Some ancient commentators treated the account as instructive fiction, others later took it as fact. That ambiguity was probably intentional, allowing the story to work on multiple levels. The allegory question matters because it shapes every later debate about Atlantis. If the island was invented to critique empire and hubris, then searches for physical ruins become secondary to understanding Plato's ideas about politics and ethics. If he intended a genuine historical kernel, then the absence of supporting evidence raises different problems about lost civilizations. Either way, the philosophical framing explains why the tale survived when countless other ancient stories faded. Its power lies less in geography than in the timeless warning that great societies can fall when they trade justice for conquest. From this interpretive foundation, the legend began its long journey through later writers and cultures. After exploring Plato's philosophical intentions, it becomes clear that the story did not remain confined to the dialogues of the 4th century BCE. Instead, Atlantis traveled across centuries as a living idea, reshaped by each age that encountered it. Welcome to this deep dive into the mystery of Atlantis. In this video, we trace the legend from its first appearance in ancient texts through centuries of speculation, geological clues, and modern searches to understand why it still fascinates us today. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. The transmission began in antiquity with writers who treated the tale as either moral illustration or faint historical memory. Aristotle, Plato's own student, reportedly dismissed the account as invention, yet other Hellenistic authors preserved fragments that kept the name alive. By the Roman period, references appear in works by historians and geographers who placed Atlantis somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules, often linking it to real or imagined Western islands. These early mentions ensured the story survived the transition from Greek to Latin scholarship, even as the original dialogues grew less central to everyday education. During the Middle Ages, the direct thread thinned but never snapped. Manuscripts of Plato circulated mainly in Byzantine centers and among Arabic translators who rendered parts of the Timaeus into Syriac and Arabic. Western European scholars encountered the story indirectly through encyclopedists such as Isidore of Seville, who recorded it among other wonders of the ancient world. Monastic libraries maintained copies, and occasional chroniclers invoked Atlantis when describing floods or lost lands in moral terms. Although interest remained limited, the classical text endured as a reference point for anyone pondering the limits of human knowledge and the fragility of civilizations. The Renaissance revived Plato's full corpus, and with it the Atlantis narrative. The rediscovery of complete Greek manuscripts, followed by Marsilio Ficino's Latin translations in the 15th century, placed the dialogues before a new audience of humanists. Scholars once again read the detailed geography and chronology, now armed with improved editions and commentaries. This revival coincided with the age of exploration. Printed maps began to depict the Atlantic with greater precision, and reports from Portuguese and Spanish voyages introduced names such as the Azores and the Canaries into European consciousness. Readers naturally wondered whether these newly charted islands might correspond to the sunken realm described by Plato. Expanding knowledge of the Atlantic world further encouraged speculation. As navigators pushed westward, the ocean itself became a space of possibility rather than mere emptiness. Early cartographers sometimes labeled hypothetical landmasses with classical names, and a few chroniclers suggested that indigenous peoples encountered in the Americas could descend from Atlantean refugees. Such ideas remain tentative, yet they illustrate how fresh geographic data continually refreshed the legend without requiring any single location to be proven. The very act of filling in blank spaces on maps invited thinkers to test Plato's coordinates against real coastlines and currents. Early historians played a modest but steady role in keeping the account visible. Renaissance commentators, such as those who annotated Ficino's editions, compared Atlantis with other classical flood stories, treating it as one thread in a larger tapestry of lost antiquity. At the same time, occult and esoteric thinkers adopted the tale for their own purposes. Writers in the Hermetic and Neoplatonic traditions saw Atlantis as evidence of an earlier golden age, whose wisdom had been preserved in fragments. These interpretations added layers of mystical significance that appealed to readers outside university circles and helped the story migrate from scholarly marginalia into broader cultural conversation. National myths also contributed to the legend's persistence. In Spain and Portugal, chroniclers occasionally linked Atlantis to ancestral voyages or to the biblical Atlantis-like accounts of submerged cities, lending patriotic resonance to the classical tale. In Northern Europe, antiquarians sometimes claimed local megaliths or coastal features as remnants of the same cataclysm. Although none of these associations amounted to rigorous history, they embedded Atlantis in popular imagination and ensured that each generation inherited the story in a slightly altered form. Over time, the narrative shifted from a classical text studied in philosophical schools to a broader cultural legend available for literary, artistic, and speculative reuse. Poets and playwrights borrowed the image of a drowned paradise. Painters depicted its temples and harbors. Compilers of wonder books listed it alongside other marvels. This diffusion meant that by the 17th and 18th centuries, Atlantis no longer belonged exclusively to Plato scholars. It had become common property, a flexible symbol of vanished glory that anyone could invoke when discussing empire, catastrophe, or the mysteries of the deep ocean. The cumulative effect of these centuries of transmission prepared the ground for active search rather than passive reading. Once the Atlantic had been mapped in outline, and once new disciplines such as geology and archaeology began to ask empirical questions about ancient coastlines, the inherited story invited testing. The same text that had served as allegory, moral warning, and esoteric cipher now stood ready to be measured against physical evidence. That transition from story preserved to location sought marks the point at which the legend of Atlantis moved from the library into the field, setting the stage for the investigations that would follow. One of the most compelling attempts to ground the Atlantis story in verifiable history centers on the volcanic island of Thera, now called Santorini, and the sophisticated Bronze Age culture that flourished on nearby Crete. Welcome to this deep dive into the mystery of Atlantis. In this video, we trace the legend from its first appearance in ancient texts through centuries of speculation, geological clues, and modern searches to understand why it still fascinates us today. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Building directly on the centuries of transmission that kept Plato's account alive, this hypothesis treats the dialogues not as pure invention, but as a distorted recollection of a real catastrophe that reshaped the eastern Mediterranean around 1600 BCE. Scholars who favor the link point to the Minoan civilization as the most plausible template for the seafaring empire Plato described, arguing that volcanic destruction on Thera could have supplied the dramatic ending, while oral traditions carried the memory across generations and languages until it reached classical Athens. The Minoans dominated the Aegean during the 2nd millennium BCE, establishing a network of palaces, trading posts, and colonies that stretched from the Greek mainland to the coasts of Asia Minor and Egypt. Their capital at Knossos on Crete featured multi-story buildings with advanced drainage systems, vibrant frescoes depicting bull-leaping rituals and maritime scenes, and extensive storerooms that testify to centralized control over agriculture and craft production. Minoan ships plied the eastern Mediterranean carrying olive oil, wine, timber, and luxury goods such as finely painted pottery and gold jewelry, giving the islanders a reach and influence that rivaled any contemporary power. This maritime supremacy allowed them to project cultural and economic dominance without large standing armies, a pattern that echoes Plato's portrayal of Atlantean influence radiating outward from a central island base. Archaeological evidence also reveals a society comfortable with monumental architecture, complex administration recorded in linear A script, and religious practices centered on nature and fertility, all of which suggest a level of refinement that later Greeks might have remembered as the height of pre-Hellenic achievement. The turning point came with the massive eruption of Thera, located roughly 100 kilometers north of Crete. Geological studies show that the volcano exploded in a series of phases, ejecting enormous volumes of ash and pumice that blanketed the surrounding region and triggered tsunamis capable of inundating coastal settlements. The caldera collapse that followed altered the island's shape permanently, leaving the dramatic cliffs and submerged crater visible today. Ash layers discovered in deep-sea cores and on the shores of Crete indicate that the event disrupted agriculture for years, while the accompanying earthquakes and flooding would have crippled the Minoan fleet and harbor facilities. Contemporary Egyptian records mention unusual darkness and crop failures around the same period, hinting that the disaster's effects rippled outward to the Nile Delta. Although the precise year remains debated, most estimates place the eruption in the mid-16th century BCE, well before the traditional date Plato assigned to Atlantis. When these events are set beside Plato's narrative, several striking parallels emerge. Both accounts describe a powerful island society destroyed suddenly by natural forces, with the sea closing over its ruins in a single cataclysmic day. The Minoans' command of the sea mirrors the naval expeditions Atlantis supposedly launched against the Mediterranean world, and their palace-centered culture with its sophisticated engineering parallels the advanced harbors, canals, and concentric rings of the Atlantean capital. Moreover, the regional dominance exercised by Minoan traders offers a concrete model for the imperial reach Plato attributed to Atlantis before its fall. These correspondences persuaded archaeologists such as Spiridon Marinitos to propose in the 1930s that the Theran eruption supplied the factual kernel for the legend, a suggestion that gained traction as further excavations revealed the extent of Minoan influence and the scale of the volcanic devastation. Yet, significant mismatches prevent the identification from being straightforward. Plato's chronology places the destruction 9,000 years before Solon, locating Atlantis in the distant past rather than the relatively recent Bronze Age. The geographic setting also differs. Atlantis is said to lie beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean, whereas Thera and Crete sit squarely inside the Mediterranean. Plato's description of a vast rectangular plain ringed by mountains and irrigated by an elaborate canal system finds no counterpart in the rugged volcanic terrain of the Aegean islands. In addition, the narrative details of a war between Atlantis and an ancient Athens do not align neatly with known Minoan history, which shows no evidence of a decisive conflict with a mainland Greek power at that time. These discrepancies lead many researchers to conclude that while the Theron eruption may have contributed vivid imagery of sudden inundation, the story as Plato recorded it incorporates later philosophical embellishments and geographic misunderstandings. Despite these weaknesses, the Minoan Thera hypothesis continues to attract the widest scholarly and popular attention of any historical candidate. Its strength lies in the convergence of independent lines of evidence: volcanic geology, Aegean archaeology, and Egyptian textual references that together document a real civilization brought low by a memorable natural disaster. The theory also benefits from the survival of Minoan material culture in the Greek cultural memory, later myths of a lost thalassocracy, and the figure of Minos himself may represent fragmented recollections of the same events. Because the hypothesis can be tested through radiocarbon dating, tephra analysis, and excavation, it remains open to refinement rather than relying solely on textual interpretation. Even critics who reject a direct equation with Atlantis acknowledge that the Theron eruption offers the clearest example of how a Bronze Age catastrophe could have been transformed, over centuries of retelling, into the moral and philosophical parable that reached Plato. In this sense, the Santorini case study illustrates both the promise and the limits of seeking Atlantis in the archaeological record, setting a standard against which subsequent proposals must be measured. While the Theron eruption and Minoan palaces offer one powerful lens for interpreting Plato's tale, other researchers have turned their attention farther west, where the Atlantic opens beyond the familiar Mediterranean basin. Welcome to this deep dive into the mystery of Atlantis. In this video, we trace the legend from its first appearance in ancient texts through centuries of speculation, geological clues, and modern searches to understand why it still fascinates us today. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Shifting focus from the Aegean to the Iberian Peninsula allows us to test whether Plato's geography might point instead toward the Atlantic Gateway, where ancient mariners once believed the known world ended. Theories locating Atlantis near Iberia center especially on the region once occupied by the semi-legendary kingdom of Tartessos, situated along the lower Guadalquivir River in what is now southwestern Spain. Proponents argue that this fertile estuary with its shifting islands and rich mineral deposits matches the fertile plain and abundant resources Plato described more closely than any Aegean island. The river's ancient course created a broad alluvial plain ringed by low hills, and seasonal flooding could have produced the kind of dramatic inundation that ends the Atlantean story. Early modern scholars such as José Pellicer de Ossau in the 17th century already linked Tartessos with Atlantis, and the idea has persisted because the area lies just outside the Pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar, which Plato explicitly names as the boundary beyond which Atlantis once ruled. Plato's reference to the pillars supplies the decisive geographic clue for these Western Mediterranean hypotheses. In the dialogues, the Atlantean Empire controls lands beyond the pillars, a phrase that for classical Greeks unambiguously indicated the Atlantic coasts rather than any location inside the Mediterranean Sea. Researchers note that the strait itself was traditionally understood as a liminal zone separating the inner sea from the outer ocean, so an island or coastal power based near the Guadalquivir Delta would sit in precisely the right position to launch naval expeditions both eastward into the Mediterranean and westward along Atlantic shores. This placement also explains why Plato's Atlanteans could threaten both Egypt and Athens while still being reachable by sea from the Greek world only after a long voyage through the pillars. Archaeological finds and landscape features have kept the speculation alive for generations. Underwater surveys off the coast of Cadiz and Huelva have revealed submerged harbor works, possible megalithic structures, and concentrations of Phoenician and earlier metalworking debris that suggest a major trading center once thrived where the river met the sea. On land, the marshes of Doñana National Park preserve traces of ancient lagoons and river channels that once formed a complex deltaic environment, while satellite imagery has revealed linear anomalies some interpret as remnants of large-scale irrigation or defensive canals. Bronze Age hoards containing Atlantic-style weapons and jewelry further hint at a wealthy coastal society engaged in long-distance exchange, elements that resonate with Plato's account of Atlantean metallurgy and maritime reach. The historical civilization of Tartessos itself attracts comparison because it combined indigenous Iberian traditions with early Phoenician influence to create an opulent, literate culture centered on silver, copper, and tin. Classical authors describe Tartessos as a kingdom ruled by long-lived kings, rich in gold and famous for its music and poetry, yet it vanished from the record by the 6th century BCE. That sudden disappearance invites parallels with Atlantis, especially since Tartessian wealth depended on control of Atlantic tin routes that could have given the kingdom the naval dominance Plato attributes to Atlantis. The culture's hybrid character, Eastern Mediterranean traders meeting local elites, also mirrors the way Plato blends Egyptian priestly knowledge with Greek philosophical framing, suggesting a memory of real intercultural contact preserved in distorted form. Nevertheless, the evidence must be weighed against several persistent objections. Floodplain misreadings remain a central problem. The Guadalquivir's repeated course changes and siltation can produce dramatic local inundations, yet none match the scale or suddenness of an entire island sinking in a single day. Chronological issues compound the difficulty. Tartessos flourished in the early 1st millennium BCE, centuries after the Bronze Age date usually assigned to any plausible kernel of the Atlantis story, and far too late for the 9,000-year span Plato records. Selective interpretation also surfaces when advocates emphasize matching details such as canals or metals while downplaying the absence of concentric harbors, elephant populations, or a war with prehistoric Athens. Western Mediterranean theories attempt to reconcile these tensions by treating Plato's text as a composite of geographic fact, philosophical exaggeration, and transmitted memory. They propose that the Pillars reference preserves a genuine directional memory of an Atlantic-facing power, while the exaggerated size and antiquity of Atlantis reflect later Greek tendencies to magnify older events. By anchoring the story in the Guadalquivir Delta, these hypotheses keep the setting inside the broader Western Mediterranean sphere that Greek sailors actually knew, yet still outside the Pillars as the text requires. In doing so, they offer a testable middle ground between pure myth and literal sunken continent, inviting continued geophysical and archaeological work that may yet clarify whether Tartessos supplied the historical spark for one of antiquity's most enduring legends. Beyond the Iberian theories that anchor Atlantis near the Pillars of Heracles, researchers have cast their nets across far wider horizons, proposing locations scattered through the Atlantic and even beyond. Welcome to this deep dive into the mystery of Atlantis. In this video, we trace the legend from its first appearance in ancient texts through centuries of speculation, geological clues, and modern searches to understand why it still fascinates us today. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. These alternative claims often arise when scholars or enthusiasts notice a single evocative detail, whether a chain of submerged peaks, scattered megalithic ruins, or echoes in local folklore, and then stretch it to fit Plato's entire narrative. Proposals cluster around the Azores, Canary Islands, the Sahara, Antarctica, and the Caribbean, each drawing on patterns of reasoning that repeat across unrelated regions. Advocates frequently invoke the idea of sunken land masses, pointing to underwater ridges or islands that appear to have once stood higher. Others highlight megalithic structures whose builders remain mysterious, or they seek mythic parallels in indigenous stories of floods and lost civilizations. These approaches gained traction especially after 19th century discoveries revealed the true scale of the oceans and the movement of continents, yet they also reveal how shifting scientific knowledge can both inspire and undermine such theories. Early maps and seafloor soundings, for instance, once suggested vast submerged continents in the Atlantic that could accommodate an Atlantean empire. The rise of plate tectonics later showed that no such large landmass had existed in the recent geological past, forcing proponents to shrink their claims or relocate them to smaller islands and coastal shelves. Similar adjustments occurred when improved dating methods placed many supposed Atlantean artifacts thousands of years outside Plato's timeline, or when ocean drilling demonstrated that certain sunken cities were actually natural formations shaped by volcanic or erosional processes. Across these scattered proposals, a handful of recurring problems surface. Advocates often cherry-pick matching details, such as Plato's mention of elephants or concentric waterways, while ignoring contradictory elements like the 9,000-year chronology or the war with prehistoric Athens. Direct evidence remains absent in every case. No inscription, artifact assemblage, or contemporary record has ever linked any of these sites to a maritime power that threatened Egypt and Greece. Instead, the story functions as a floating label attached to whatever local mystery happens to lack an explanation at the moment, whether it is the origin of certain stone circles, the disappearance of an ancient trade route, or unexplained underwater anomalies. This pattern turns Atlantis into a versatile template, rather than a fixed historical event. In the Azores, for example, volcanic islands and deep surrounding trenches invite speculation about a once larger landmass that foundered, yet the island's geology shows steady building rather than catastrophic collapse on the required scale. The Canaries offer similar volcanic terrain plus faint traces of pre-Hispanic cultures, prompting claims of a stepping stone civilization, but again without evidence of the advanced metallurgy or naval reach Plato describes. Desert landscapes in the Sahara spark ideas of a fertile plain turned arid by climate shift, drawing on mythic flood parallels from North African traditions, yet the region's archaeological record shows gradual desiccation rather than sudden inundation of a sophisticated city. Farther afield, Antarctica attracts attention because of mid-20th century maps that some interpret as showing ice-free coasts, suggesting an advanced society later buried by advancing ice sheets. Caribbean proposals often cite submerged platforms around Cuba or the Bahamas, linking them to mythic parallels in indigenous flood stories. Each case follows the same imaginative leap. A suggestive landform or cultural fragment stands in for the whole of Plato's account. The contrast with standards of historical proof becomes clear when these possibilities are measured against the methods used for verified ancient sites. Historians and archaeologists require convergent lines of evidence, including contemporary texts, datable artifacts, and consistent environmental data, none of which have materialized for any alternative Atlantis location. Imaginative reconstructions remain valuable for stimulating public interest and prompting new surveys, yet they cannot substitute for the rigorous testing that has anchored other legends, such as the volcanic destruction of Thera or the trading networks of Tartessos, in verifiable reality. By keeping multiple candidates in view without privileging any single one, these theories illustrate how the Atlantis story continues to migrate across the map, adapting to each new discovery while still awaiting the kind of concrete proof that would move it from speculation into history. After exploring so many scattered proposals for Atlantis across the Atlantic and beyond, it becomes essential to step back and ask what the Earth itself actually permits. Modern geology provides a clear framework through plate tectonics that explains how continents and ocean basins behave over time. The planet's outer shell consists of rigid plates that drift slowly, at rates of just a few centimeters per year, driven by heat from the interior. Submerged landscapes do exist, but they result from gradual processes like erosion, sediment deposition, or changes in sea level rather than sudden wholesale disappearance. Ocean basins themselves formed over hundreds of millions of years through seafloor spreading at mid-ocean ridges, where new crust emerges and older crust sinks at subduction zones. No mechanism allows an entire mid-ocean continent the size Plato described to sink rapidly beneath the waves in a single catastrophic event. Such a sudden vanishing would require impossible volumes of crust to be removed or densified overnight, violating the basic physics of how plates interact. Instead, any land that once stood above water in the open Atlantic has either always been small volcanic islands or has remained submerged since long before human history. This rules out the dramatic mid-ocean continent sinking that fuels many popular Atlantis stories. Real geological processes can still erase coastlines and settlements, however, and these deserve careful attention because they align with verifiable evidence. Sea level rise after the last ice age lifted global oceans by more than 100 meters over several thousand years, drowning coastal plains, river mouths, and low-lying islands. Earthquakes along plate boundaries can drop shorelines by several meters in minutes, while associated tsunamis inundate and scour settlements with powerful waves. These events happen repeatedly in tectonically active regions such as the Mediterranean and the edges of the Atlantic, leaving behind submerged ruins or sediment layers that record sudden local change. The key distinction lies between these localized catastrophes and the vanishing of an entire continent. A city, or even a small kingdom, can be destroyed or submerged without affecting the broader geography of an ocean basin. A true continent-sized landmass, by contrast, would leave unmistakable traces in the rock record, magnetic signatures, and crustal thickness that simply do not appear in the Atlantic seafloor. Geology therefore functions as a filter that tests which Atlantis scenarios remain physically possible. Proposals requiring a large landmass to sink in the deep ocean fail this test outright. Scenarios located on continental shelves, volcanic islands, or tectonically active coasts fare better because they can accommodate gradual inundation or sudden local destruction without contradicting plate motions. This scientific boundary helps explain why more restrained regional hypotheses continue to attract serious interest. Locations near the Strait of Gibraltar or around the Aegean fit within known patterns of sea level change and seismic activity, allowing researchers to examine them without invoking impossible geology. By anchoring speculation to what the Earth can actually do, geology narrows the field and keeps the search focused on evidence that can be checked against real sedimentary and volcanic records. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this as we continue weighing these limits against the stories that still circulate today. The persistence of Atlantis theories often stems from understandable confusion between visible underwater features and the much larger claims they are asked to support. Sonar mapping has revealed seamounts, ridges, and drowned river valleys across the Atlantic, yet these formations arose through volcanic construction or falling sea levels rather than the collapse of a sophisticated civilization. Plate tectonics further shows that the Atlantic opened gradually as the Americas separated from Europe and Africa, beginning more than 150 million years ago. Any hypothetical continent in the middle would have had to ride a plate that simply does not exist in the required form or location during the time frame Plato provides. When stories describe an island empire disappearing overnight, they invoke a speed of change that matches neither subduction nor rifting. Instead, the process is capable of removing land from human view, operate on scales of centuries to millennia for sea level effects, or seconds to minutes for earthquakes and tsunamis. The latter can certainly obliterate harbors and fields, as documented in historical events around the Aegean and the Iberian margin, but they leave the surrounding ocean floor unchanged. This contrast becomes useful when evaluating specific claims. A settlement on a subsiding delta or a volcanic flank can vanish locally while the broader region remains intact, matching the kind of evidence archaeologists actually recover. A mid-ocean continent cannot. By applying these constraints, geology also clarifies why certain locations keep resurfacing in discussions. Coastal zones that experienced post-glacial flooding or repeated seismic shaking offer plausible settings for lost cities without requiring the impossible. Inland seas or straits that once connected larger bodies of water can likewise create the impression of vanished geography when water levels shift. These mechanisms do not prove any particular site was Atlantis, yet they demonstrate which stories remain compatible with physical reality and which must be set aside. The result is a sharper conversation that separates the possible from the fantastic, while still leaving room for the regional catastrophes that have repeatedly reshaped human coastlines throughout history. Understanding these geological boundaries also illuminates how earlier generations interpreted the same evidence before plate tectonics was understood. 19th century maps sometimes depicted large submerged areas in the Atlantic because bathymetric data were incomplete, leading enthusiasts to imagine sunken continents that later surveys simply did not confirm. Once the mechanism of seafloor spreading became clear, those interpretations lost their foundation. Contemporary research instead focuses on smaller scale features such as drowned paleo shorelines or tsunami deposits that can be dated and linked to known tectonic settings. This shift does not eliminate the mystery, but confines it to questions that instruments and fieldwork can actually address. The same standards reveal why some scenarios survive scrutiny while others do not. Any hypothesis demanding rapid disappearance of thousands of square kilometers in the open ocean conflicts with crustal buoyancy and the absence of corresponding deep-sea sediment or magnetic anomalies. Hypotheses that invoke only local sea level rise or a single earthquake and tsunami wave train remain testable through coarse bathymetry and dating methods already applied successfully at other ancient sites. In this way, geology serves not as a final verdict, but as a necessary checkpoint that keeps speculation tethered to observable processes. It explains both the enduring appeal of regional candidates and the consistent rejection of grand mid-ocean solutions, guiding future work toward shorelines and shelves where real change has demonstrably occurred. In this part of our journey through the mystery of Atlantis, we shift from geological filters to the careful toolkit archaeologists use when weighing claims of a lost civilization. As we move forward together, I invite you to comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this so we can keep this conversation grounded in the real standards that separate speculation from verified history. Archaeology treats evidence for any lost society as material traces that can be recovered, dated, and placed within a wider cultural sequence. A genuine candidate must produce consistent artifacts, architecture, and environmental data that match the scale and sophistication described in ancient texts, while also fitting known regional chronologies. Isolated finds such as a single carved stone or an unusual sediment layer never suffice on their own, because they could result from trade, natural deposition, or later disturbance. Instead, scholars look for repeated patterns across multiple sites and independent datasets that together build a coherent picture of settlement, trade networks, and sudden or gradual abandonment. To gather that kind of evidence, archaeologists rely on several complementary methods. Excavation remains the most direct approach, carefully removing layers of soil to expose foundations, hearths, and discarded objects in their original stratigraphic order. Each layer is recorded with precise measurements so later researchers can reconstruct the sequence of occupation and any abrupt changes that might signal a destructive event. Dating techniques then anchor those layers to calendar time. Radiocarbon analysis of charcoal or bone, thermoluminescence of pottery, and dendrochronology of preserved wood all provide overlapping age ranges that must align before a claim gains traction. Remote sensing adds a non-destructive layer by using ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and satellite imagery to map buried structures across wide areas without immediate digging. Marine archaeology extends the same principles underwater through sonar surveys, submersible inspections, and careful recovery of submerged artifacts, allowing teams to document harbors or coastal settlements now beneath the waves. Textual comparison closes the loop by cross-checking archaeological sequences against surviving inscriptions, administrative records, and literary accounts to see whether the material remains match the scale, technology, or political organization described in the sources. Extraordinary claims such as the existence of a sophisticated island empire require these lines of evidence to converge rather than rest on single anomalies. An unusual underwater wall might spark interest, yet without matching pottery styles, consistent dating across several structures, and textual references that align with the same period and region, the feature stays an intriguing curiosity rather than proof of anything larger. Convergence means the excavation yields the expected artifact types. The dates cluster tightly around a proposed destruction horizon. Remote sensing reveals a coherent urban layout. Marine surveys recover trade goods, linking the site to known cultures. And ancient texts describe comparable events or places. When any one strand fails to match the others, the hypothesis must be revised or set aside. This same demand for multiple independent lines also clarifies the difference between absence of evidence and evidence against a specific proposal. Absence simply means a location has not yet been surveyed thoroughly enough to rule possibilities in or out. Evidence against, by contrast, appears when exhaustive work has been completed and the expected signatures are missing or contradicted. For instance, if a theory predicts a large urban center with monumental architecture and extensive trade goods, yet decades of excavation and survey recover only small-scale villages with local materials and no signs of sudden inundation, the proposal itself faces direct challenge. The distinction matters because it prevents premature dismissal of understudied areas while still allowing firm rejection once the data are in. Frauds, sensational media coverage, and confirmation bias further complicate the picture. Fabricated artifacts or altered photographs have repeatedly surfaced in popular accounts, only to collapse under laboratory scrutiny of tool marks, material composition, or contextual inconsistencies. Media outlets often amplify preliminary announcements before peer review, creating public expectations that later careful work cannot meet. Confirmation bias leads investigators to emphasize supportive details while overlooking contradictory data, such as dates that fall centuries outside the proposed timeframe or artifact styles that belong to entirely different cultures. These distortions slow progress because they consume resources on debunking rather than on systematic survey, and because they erode public trust when promised breakthroughs fail to materialize. No claimed discovery has yet satisfied the full suite of scholarly standards required to identify any site with Atlantis. Every proposal examined so far either lacks the predicted scale of remains, shows chronological mismatches with textual accounts, or fails to produce converging data from excavation, dating, remote sensing, and marine work. Some locations display intriguing local catastrophes consistent with sea level rise or seismic activity, yet none combine those traces with the political and cultural footprint described in the original sources. The absence of such convergence does not close the broader question of how ancient societies experienced environmental change, but it does keep the specific identification of Atlantis in the realm of hypothesis rather than established fact. Archaeologists therefore approach each new survey with explicit research designs that test falsifiable predictions. Before fieldwork begins, teams outline what artifact assemblages, architectural forms, and environmental signals would support or refute a given scenario. They then collect data in controlled grids or transects so results can be replicated by independent groups. When underwater conditions limit visibility, they rely on systematic dredging and core sampling rather than selective recovery of eye-catching objects. Laboratory protocols further guard against bias by requiring blind testing of samples and cross-checks between multiple dating laboratories. These procedures may seem slow compared with dramatic announcements, yet they ensure that any future identification rests on solid ground rather than on enthusiasm alone. The emphasis on converging evidence also encourages collaboration across disciplines. Geologists supply sea level curves and seismic histories that archaeologists incorporate into their models. Chemists analyze residues on pottery to trace ancient diets and trade routes. Linguists evaluate how place names and descriptions might have shifted across translations and retellings. Each specialist contributes a separate data stream that must intersect with the others before conclusions are drawn. When these streams remain separate or contradictory, the claim stays unproven. When they align across excavation records, absolute dates, geophysical maps, and textual parallels, the case strengthens. Public fascination with Atlantis sometimes pressures researchers to present preliminary findings as breakthroughs, Yet professional ethics require clear statements of uncertainty. A promising sediment layer or a suggestive geophysical anomaly is labeled exactly that, an anomaly, until further work either strengthens or removes it from consideration. This cautious language protects both the scientific record and the communities whose heritage is being studied. It also leaves room for genuine surprises, because new technologies such as high-resolution bathymetric LiDAR or ancient DNA extraction can reopen questions previously considered closed. Even so, the new data must still pass through the same filters of context, dating, and convergence before they alter the scholarly consensus. In practice, the process resembles assembling a mosaic from scattered tiles rather than discovering a single smoking gun. Each excavation season adds a few more pieces. Each dating run refines the timeline, and each remote sensing campaign fills in blank spaces on the map. Over years or decades, the picture either sharpens into a recognizable pattern or remains too fragmentary to support firm identification. Atlantis hypotheses have so far produced many scattered tiles without forming the larger image required by the textual description. That outcome does not diminish the value of the work, because the same methods have successfully identified and dated numerous other submerged or destroyed settlements whose stories were never preserved in myth. The standards also protect against the opposite error of dismissing every underwater feature simply because Atlantis claims have often been overstated. Systematic regional surveys around tectonically active coasts have documented real cases of harbor facilities and villages inundated by gradual sea level rise or sudden subsidence. These verified examples demonstrate that archaeology can recognize lost settlements when the evidence converges. The same capability means that if a future project ever assembles the full suite of matching data for a site of appropriate size and date, the identification would be accepted. Until that threshold is crossed, however, the claim remains unproven. By keeping these evidentiary rules in view, the search for Atlantis becomes less about locating a single lost city and more about understanding how ancient societies responded to environmental pressures. The methods described, excavation, dating, remote sensing, marine archaeology, and textual comparison, apply equally to modest coastal hamlets and to hypothetical empires. They reward patience, replication, and interdisciplinary cooperation while filtering out noise from fraud, hype, and selective interpretation. No present discovery has cleared that bar, yet the framework itself remains ready for whatever new information future fieldwork may bring. As these standards continue to guide research, the conversation stays tethered to observable reality rather than to wishful thinking. The same careful approach that has illuminated so many other chapters of the human past now stands ready to evaluate any future candidate for Atlantis with the rigor it deserves. As we turn now to the deeper question of why Atlantis continues to grip our imagination, long after every archaeological test has come up empty, this part of the journey explores the legend not as a place to be found, but as a mirror for our own hopes and anxieties. Before we dive in, I invite you to comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this so we can share how this ancient story still speaks to people across every time zone. Atlantis endures because it condenses three timeless themes into one vivid image: a lost golden age of harmony and achievement, a sudden catastrophe that wipes it away, and the warning that human pride invites ruin. These motifs appear in cultures far older than Plato, yet his version gave them a single memorable name and location that later generations could reuse. When we speak of Atlantis today, we are really speaking of every society that seemed invincible until the sea or the earth reclaimed it, and that resonance explains why the story refuses to fade even in an age of satellites and sonar. Its influence spreads through literature first and most obviously. From Francis Bacon's New Atlantis to Jules Verne's Underwater Kingdoms, and modern novels that recast the island as everything from an advanced energy source to a cautionary tale of genetic hubris, writers have borrowed the name to explore what perfect societies might look like and why they fail. In each retelling, the core ingredients remain the same: technological brilliance, moral decay, and a flood that erases the evidence. That formula travels easily across genres because it lets authors dramatize anxieties about their own moment without needing to invent an entirely new mythology. Esoteric traditions took the story in another direction, treating Atlantis as literal hidden knowledge rather than allegory. Theosophists, channelers, and alternative historians placed advanced civilizations on the mid-Atlantic ridge or beneath Antarctic ice, claiming that survivors seeded the pyramids, Stonehenge, and every other monument whose construction still puzzles us. These interpretations flourished precisely because they offered an alternative to the slow, incremental picture of human progress favored by academic history. They promised secret continuity between ancient masters and modern seekers, and they continue to sell books and conference tickets because the promise of lost wisdom feels more exciting than the archaeological record of gradual invention and trade. Nationalist movements have also pressed Atlantis into service. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, some European writers linked it to supposed Aryan migrations or to the origins of their own coastal cultures, while others used the story to assert that their homeland once ruled a vast maritime empire. Tourism boards from the Azores to the Bahamas still market local ruins or underwater formations as possible Atlantean remnants, turning the legend into economic branding. The same flexibility that lets novelists invent new endings lets politicians and promoters claim the island for whichever identity needs an ancient pedigree. Popular media keeps the symbol alive for audiences who may never read Plato. Films, video games, and documentaries present Atlantis as a high-tech paradise destroyed by hubris or climate shift, often updating the catastrophe to match current headlines about rising seas or megastorms. The visual language is consistent: gleaming towers, crystal power sources, and a final wall of water. These depictions succeed because they let viewers experience both wonder at lost achievement and relief that our own civilization might still avoid the same fate. Modern audiences are drawn to mysteries that sit between fact and fiction because they offer the best of both worlds. A purely fictional tale can be dismissed as entertainment, while a fully verified historical event loses its aura of the unknown. Atlantis occupies the fertile middle ground where possibility remains open. Viewers can enjoy the thrill of potential discovery without committing to any single location, and they can debate the evidence in comment sections and forums without needing laboratory credentials. That participatory quality turns the legend into a shared cultural puzzle rather than a closed case. The story also reflects contemporary fears about collapse, climate, and civilizational fragility. When sea level rise threatens coastal cities and extreme weather events multiply, the image of an island swallowed overnight feels newly relevant. Atlantis gives concrete shape to abstract worries that our own interconnected world could unravel faster than our institutions can respond. At the same time, the legend reassures us that earlier societies faced similar shocks and that some memory of them survived, suggesting that fragments of knowledge might outlast any single catastrophe. The endurance of the tale therefore tells us as much about ourselves as about the ancient past. We return to Atlantis whenever we sense that progress is fragile, whenever we long for a simpler or more advanced predecessor civilization, and whenever we need a narrative that explains why great powers sometimes vanish without trace. The myth evolves with each generation because it absorbs whatever anxieties are most pressing at the moment: imperial overreach in one era, technological arrogance in another, environmental tipping points in our own. In scientific societies, the legend functions as a case study in how myths adapt rather than disappear. Instead of being discarded when geology and archaeology fail to confirm it, Atlantis is repurposed as a thought experiment about what evidence would be required to prove any lost civilization. It becomes a teaching tool for discussing the difference between plausible catastrophe and verifiable history, and for illustrating how popular culture and scholarship continually renegotiate the boundary between them. Far from being a distraction, the story keeps public attention focused on real questions of coastal change, ancient seafaring, and the limits of textual evidence. By holding these layers together, Atlantis remains a living symbol rather than a dusty footnote. It lets us rehearse our own possible endings while still hoping that, like the fragments Plato preserved, something valuable might survive the flood. In this closing chapter of our exploration, we pull together the threads of evidence, speculation, and cultural resonance that have followed Atlantis from Plato's pages to modern screens, weighing what can still be learned when the search itself becomes the story. Before we begin, comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this so we can close the circle together across every time zone. The strongest threads of evidence all circle back to Plato's own text and the geological events that could have inspired it. The catastrophic eruption and tsunami at Santorini around 1600 BCE match the scale and suddenness of the disaster he describes, while the sophisticated Minoan culture on Crete supplies a plausible real-world model for an advanced island power that later faded from memory. Along the western Mediterranean and Atlantic margins, submerged coastal settlements and sediment layers record repeated flooding events that ancient observers could easily have woven into a single dramatic tale. These fragments give the legend a foothold in verifiable history, yet the limits are equally clear and decisive. No harbor works, no inscriptions, and no artifacts bearing the name Atlantis or matching Plato's precise dimensions have ever surfaced. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge and other proposed deepwater sites show no trace of a sunken continent, and the timeline Plato supplies conflicts with every established chronology of human civilization. Satellite mapping and sonar surveys have eliminated the possibility of a large landmass vanishing in the Atlantic within the last 12,000 years. What remains is possibility without confirmation, a narrowing corridor that still refuses to close. That corridor leaves three main interpretations standing side by side. Atlantis may be pure allegory, crafted by Plato to illustrate the dangers of hubris and the fragility of even the best-ordered state. It may preserve a distorted cultural memory of real disasters, the Thera eruption, repeated Mediterranean floods, or the collapse of Bronze Age societies, transmitted through generations until it reached Athens in the form of an Egyptian priest's tale. Or it may be complete invention, a literary device that happened to echo real catastrophes closely enough to feel true. Each reading accounts for some of the data, none accounts for all of it. The result is a story that sits permanently at the border between literature and history. Plato himself presents it as both, a narrative handed down from Solon yet framed inside a philosophical dialogue whose larger purpose is ethical rather than factual. Later readers have never been able to settle the question because the text supplies neither enough detail to prove a real place nor enough signals to dismiss it as fiction. Archaeology and geology continue to shrink the options, yet the narrative itself remains intact because it was never required to function as a map. This unresolved status carries a broader lesson. Mystery can persist even when evidence narrows the field, because some questions are designed to live in the space between verifiable fact and enduring pattern. The search for Atlantis has not delivered a lost city, but it has repeatedly forced us to refine how we weigh ancient testimony against physical traces, how we distinguish cultural memory from invention, and how we recognize our own anxieties reflected in older stories. Each generation discovers new reasons the island might matter, whether those reasons are geological, political, or environmental, and each generation adds another layer to the legend without ever pinning it down. In the end, the continuing fascination reveals far more about human storytelling than about any single sunken city. We return to Atlantis whenever we need a concrete image for the sudden loss of achievement, whenever we want to warn against overreach, and whenever we hope that something of value might survive the flood. The legend endures not because the island is waiting to be found, but because the questions it raises about memory, catastrophe, and meaning remain open. That openness is what keeps the conversation alive long after the last sonar sweep has come up empty.